Hello. Hello, children. How do you do? Good morning. This morning, I'm sure you're fine, right? I'm so delighted to welcome you to this class this morning. Do you get it now? And I'm sure you're set for me, right? Are you set for this class? Do you have your writing materials with you? Right? Are you set? Yes. So this morning, we're going to be looking at a clause. Oh, Mrs. Martha, what is a clause? Yes, relax. I will tell you what a clause is. So when talking about a clause is a group of words that has a subject and a verb. A group of words that has a subject and a verb. Do you get it now? Be like, oh, Mrs. Martha, I know what a verb is. A verb is an action word, like go, like sit, but what of a subject? Yes, I will tell you what a subject is. A subject is the doer of an action, someone that performs the action. Do you get it now? Look at this example. Mrs. Martha teaches. Mrs. Martha teaches. In that example, you already know your verb. You know that our verb is teaches, right? So, what is Mrs. Martha in that sentence? Mrs. Martha in that sentence is the subject because she is the one performing the action of teaching. Do you get it? So don't forget, I told you that a clause is a group of words that has a subject and her verb. So in that sentence, Mrs. Martha teaches. Mrs. Martha is the subject because she's the one carrying out the action of teaching. Do you get it now? So let me show you this.
A clause is a group of related words that consist of both a subject and a verb. The following sentence is a clause. The student studied in the library. You can see that the sentence contains a subject, in this case the student, and a verb, studied. It is important to note that both the subject and the verb is required to form a clause. If you only have either a subject or a verb, the group of words may form a phrase, but not a complete clause. For example, the group of word studies biology is not a clause because it does not contain a subject. To be a clause, there needs to be a subject in the sentence. You need to identify who it is that studies biology. For example, a complete clause would be, Jane studies biology.
A clause can be a complete sentence or a part of a sentence. A sentence can have one clause or more than one clause.
For example, the sun rises in the east.
Here, the clause is the complete sentence. In the backyard, the dog ran behind the cat. Here, the clause is a part of the sentence. Whenever Akbar gave Birbal a tricky problem, Birbal solved it easily.
Here the two clauses are,
Whenever Akbar gave Birbal a tricky problem and
Birbal solved it easily. A clause is
either
independent or dependent. An independent clause makes complete sense on its own. For example,
football is an interesting game, though it requires a lot of energy.
A dependent clause depends on another clause to make complete sense. For example,
Whenever Akbar gave Birbal a tricky problem, Birbal solved it easily.
There are two kinds of clauses, independent and dependent. They both have subject and verb teams. The only difference is that an independent clause makes sense and is a complete thought all by itself. A dependent clause needs more information to be a complete thought. Here's how it works. The cat is sleeping. This is an independent clause. It has a subject and verb team and makes sense by itself. If I add the word when at the beginning, does it still sound complete? No, it has become a dependent clause because it needs more information. I want to know what happens when the cat is sleeping. When the cat is sleeping, the mice will play. Now it makes sense. Here's another one. I was watching TV. Does this sound like a complete thought? Does it make sense by itself? Yes, it does. And it has a subject and verb team. Does this still sound complete when I add while in the front of it? While I was watching TV. No, now it's a dependent clause because it depends on more information to be complete. While I was watching TV, my mom was cooking supper. Now that makes sense. Here's one more. I studied hard for my test. Does that sound complete and make sense by itself? Yes, it does. And it has a subject and verb team. Now read it. Does it still sound complete? No, it doesn't any longer. Because I studied hard for my test needs more information. Because I studied hard for my test, I earned an A. Now it's a complete thought. The words that I added at the beginning of the clauses are called subordinating conjunctions, or subordinators. Here are some examples. I say that these subordinators weaken the independent clause so that it can't stand alone anymore. It needs more support to make sense and be a complete thought. So, subordinators turn an independent clause into a dependent clause. They both still have a subject and verb team, but the independent makes sense by itself. The dependent needs more information.
From that video, you've learned that there is no clause without a subject, right? Yes. And again, you've learned the two types of a clause. You've learned that there are two types of a clause. That is dependent clause. You see the way, can you see me? Dependent. I can fall that way because I cannot stand alone. Dependent. And again, independent clause. You can see I'm standing now because I am independent. I can stand alone. But when I am dependent, I cannot stand. I will need to bend. I need something to rely on. Do you get it now? So when you want to remember what a dependent clause is, think of yourself because you can be called a dependent clause. Yes, you are a dependent clause because you depend on your parents for survival. Do you get it now? You cannot stand alone. You cannot live without your parents. Do you get it now? And when you think of a independent clause, then think of your parents. Your parents don't need your help to stand. They can stand alone without your help. Do you get it now? You are a dependent clause, whereas your parents are independent clauses. Do you get it now? Do you understand? Yes, and in the course of the video, you heard about predicates. Now, when talking about a predicate, don't forget I told you that a clause must have a subject and a verb. But we're not talking about a predicate. A predicate occurs when you have some other words at the end of a verb. For example, Mrs. Martha teaches. There, you only have the subject and the verb. Do you get it now? Yes. But take this one. Mrs. Martha teaches literacy. In that sentence, you have Mrs. Martha as the subject. Then you have teaches literacy as the predicate. When you're talking about a predicate, you'll be talking about the verb and every other word that come after the verb in a sentence. Do you get it now? So Mrs. Martha teaches literacy. Teaches literacy is a predicate. Do you understand now? Yes. And again, you learned that a dependent clause has a subordinator. Yes. Do you know what a subordinator is? A subordinator is also a conjunction. Yes, subordinators are also conjunctions. But those subordinators are the ones that we use to turn an independent clause to a dependent clause. Do you get it now?
Now we want to decide if the words written in the red pen, whether they are dependent clauses or independent clauses. So number 1, John did his homework before he went to bed. Now John did his homework. Is it a dependent clause or an independent clause? Does it make sense on its own? John did his homework. Yes, it makes sense on its own. So it's an independent clause. I don't like Mondays. I don't like Mondays. Is it dependent or independent? Does it need additional information to make sense? No. So it is an independent clause. If you help me, I will help you. If you help me, is it a dependent clause or an independent clause? If you help me, what will happen? So it is a dependent clause. Do you get it? Yes. A dependent clause. A dependent. Now number 4. I need a calculator. I need a new calculator. Is it dependent or independent? Does it need to depend on another expression to make meaning? Or is it meaningful on its own? Yes, it's meaningful on its own. So it is an independent clause. Yes. Yes. She's very fit because she goes running every day. Now, because she goes running every day, is it a dependent clause or an independent clause? Because she goes running every day. Can it stand alone? Does it make sense on its own? No, no, no. So it is a dependent clause. A dependent clause. Can you tell me why you said that? Now, can you tell me, is it a dependent or an independent clause? Can you tell me? It makes sense, right? On its own. Yes, so it is an independent clause. So today you've learned about a clause, the types of clause, and how to identify each of them. So that about our class for today. See you next class. Bye, bye, bye.